Hello, Coffee and Catholics crew. First off, you may have noticed that I just jumped right in today before the music. We'll get to that in just a moment, but I wanted to first apologize for this episode being a week late. If you follow us on Facebook in our Facebook group or on Instagram, you'll know that there's a whole story behind it. But I really appreciate everybody's patience and prayers and support while I was just dealing with being a mom and lost things. And so apologies again for this episode being a week late, but we'll still have next week's episode next week. So we're already working on getting that one edited and out for you. Please enjoy this third and final episode about virtues. Hello and welcome to Coffee and Catholics, a Catholic women's talk show podcast. I'm Stacy, one of your hosts, and with me I have...
Hi, I'm Alisha.
I'm Annie.
And I'm Lauren.
Hello, welcome to Coffee and Catholics. This week we are going to continue our virtue series, and we are going to be talking about chastity and diligence, again with humility woven in. If you are just now listening to this episode 60 and 59, we also talked about virtues. And so if you want to go back and see what we talked about there, feel free to do so. So chastity, while we always think, a lot of times we think of chastity in context of sex. It could be other, we could be lusting over other things also, because chastity defeats lust.
And you have to be diligent in your chastity.
And so they go together. Yes, they do. They go together well. So chastity within marriage, or between people that are married, you think that, well, that's the end of that, right? Chastity is for people that are trying to live by the rules that the church has set out before they get married, or while they're singles or dating, or while they're growing up and teenagers. We hear a lot about chastity, the virtue of chastity, in these groups, these subsets of the church. But it actually has a huge role in marriage. And I'd love to kick off the conversation talking about how chastity, how the Lord is moving me towards chastity in my own life and in our own marriage, and the struggles that we've had with that in those veins. And I think it really has to do a lot with, for me, the governing of my eyes and my appetites. And sometimes that has a lot to do with sex, and sometimes not. Sometimes it has to do with following the rules that the church has laid out for us within marriage life. It's very tempting, if you are familiar with what the church has said about the marriage bed and about what goes on between husbands and wives in that sacramental moment of union. The church does have actual guidelines that we have to follow as Catholics in order to be faithful to her and to the Lord in turn. But it can be really easy at certain stages of life, or to certain seasons of life, or just situations that arise in this context, to bend or break those rules a little bit. And it's a big temptation, and it has been, I think, for us, for a lot of couples. And so it's for us, it has to do with, are we, when we're approaching each other in the intimacy of our marriage bed, are we doing this with the other's good in mind? Are we doing this with our eyes toward God and seeing this as a way to connect with each other, facing with our eyes, on heaven? Even in the marriage bed, God can be brought into that. Or are we doing it just to satisfy our own desires or predilections or wants? And I think anyone that's married, when we look at it within this context, can say, oh yeah, there's a lot of room here for virtue to come in and to be used as we talk about this. So that's how it's kind of showed up in our lives. It's being faithful to those rules that the church has given us, which protect us and protect each other, but also just guarding your eyes from things that we watch, like on TV. There's been a lot of conversations or shows that we've had to turn off because it just wasn't something I wanted to see, or wanted him to see, or he wanted to see, or wanted me to see. And so I think it has a lot to do with just governing the appetites, particularly those that are sexual within marriage. And that's just us. And I'm inviting, obviously, anyone else to correct me if I'm wrong.
I know I have times where I've been like reading a book and it gets into some different things and I'm like finding like, oh, this is maybe not directing my mind towards, the, what it should be. And having to, having the we've talked about how the humility kind of really intertwines with all these virtues, but having the humility to see that, oh, this isn't leading me down that path. Even though I'm really interested in this book, I need to go ahead and put it down.
That's really hard. And it's so frustrating because I feel like if you're a reader too, I don't know, I feel like every book that is written these days, even the good, beautiful ones, there's always that one little moment. And while I'm not saying you have to totally discard it,
right.
It's just frustrating that we can't just allow stories to just be stories without throwing that impropriety or that anti-chaste moment in, just to make sure the book sells. And I have friends that write books and they're writers, they do well. And they have said to me before that there are certain publishers that will not publish it if there isn't some sort of spice in it.
Wow.
Which is great. It just tells you where our culture is. And these are even publishers that publish good and beautiful books.
Well, you even see some commercials. I mean, you can even turn on, like, even if you're trying to watch a more, I wouldn't say necessarily holy, but a more pure show, than even the commercials that happen in between. Sometimes you can even get onto YouTube to show kids something without the commercials there being
so
sexualized.
You can't watch I've tried to watch like baking shows or different the commercials that show up for the other things put out by those networks. I either have to be muting or I'm really good at the distracting and asking questions or because my kids are still young and I can redirect them or mute it at that time. But yeah, it's really it's just is so intertwined in there. What I was going to add on with with books, I'm not saying everybody needs if there's something in it you have to. For me, it was there have been personal instances where I've noticed I've had some books where I'm reading and it's it has some scenes or something in there and it doesn't really have it. Know. But then there's others where I'm it's been more that it's not it's been more of a it's having me desire things that I would, or feeling I'm not being fulfilled in my marriage because this is going on in here.
Yeah,
that those type of things where it's more making me resentful towards my own spouse.
Well, and I think I like how you guys have kind of brought it from kind of the micro level up to the macro level, because we do have a society that is really kind of a society of sexuality and of lustfulness. And I mean, I guess that's been going on, since Moses came down from the mountain and, all of that was going on. Yeah. But one thing that I know I've been trying to guard my children against is that in our society, how prevalent it is and how important our society makes it. And then also, I think especially more recently within the last, several years, maybe 5 to 10 years, really the acceleration and the sexualization of children in our culture. And it's disturbing. It's scary how just certain laws that certain states are trying to pass. But yeah, it's just the certain things that are going on around in society that, I don't want my children to be a part of. I don't want my daughter to see it because I don't want her to emulate this or think that this is something that ought to be emulated by, exposing skin or finding, having your value in what other people think of you in a sexual way. And I don't want my son seeing all these sexual things that are going on, especially at such a young age that they are at, because even in hearing it in music and stuff like that, because I don't want them thinking of women in that way, or even thinking of themselves in a sexual way that as they grow up and they mature and they start understanding these types of things, that these become norms in their lives because they've been hearing it in music, they've been hearing it in movies, seeing it in movies and all of these things. Because I know when I was younger, chastity wasn't so much on my mind. I saw my value in what other people thought of me. And specifically when it came to men, I wanted to feel like I was attractive to them. And so I remember wearing low-cut tops and tight clothes, even though I was so uncomfortable doing so. But this is the way that I was going to be able to find my value. This is the way that I just somehow, my parents didn't teach me this, but through, I think, the music that I was listening to, the friends that I had that had these values, the movies that I was watching, the TV shows, I remember very specific TV shows learning, oh, well, if I look like that, or if I have that, I'm going to be gross and I'm not going to be wanted by men or by these other people who were making fun of this particular person on screen. And so, yeah, I think that, people think that, chastity, is such a buzzkill. Like, that's no fun, but that's not what it's about. It's not about a lack of fun. We Catholics tend, not always, and it's totally fine to not have many children or any children at all, especially if you're not able to have them. But a lot of Catholics are kind of known, the stereotype is for having a lot of children. We're okay with sex.
We have fun.
We have fun too.
We have fun, and we do a lot of practice having fun.
Exactly. So that stereotype is mood. It's void. But there are, like you were talking about, quote unquote rules or guidelines, I should say, that that the church does teach us, and it's not just to interfere with what we've got going on in the bedroom. But it's because out of love for us, because these are things, biblical things that Jesus has taught us that have been handed down by the church.
Protect us from objectifying each other.
Exactly.
And if you look at some of the minor details, I remember thinking when I'm reading through them, like, come on. Like, at one point, I did not appreciate what I felt like that was an intrusion into, little things, like into our... I felt like it was nitpicky, but when I disregarded those things, when we did choose to disregard those things, or when we made light of them without really looking at them, we missed the fact that after having looked at them, what we saw was that these are guidelines that keep us from making objects of each other and using each other for pleasure or for at will, and so.
Yeah, so it's really like, if you're going to call them rules, they're rules for how to love one another fully and authentically.
Well, I know we were talking a lot about like how society, and I think modesty does play a part in chastity, but when we really get down to it, it's our reactions to others and how, like you were just saying, it's how we react to seeing somebody who maybe isn't dressed what we would consider modest, or, it comes back to, are we looking at that person as an object to fulfill our desires, or are we looking at them as the person God made them to be, regardless of how they're dressed? Because, we get into, sometimes it's our society, but also sometimes it's just how another culture is. And so when we look at other cultures and things, are we looking at this native dress or the how these people dress and lusting after them? Or are we looking at them and appreciating them for the culture that they're in and why they have these customs? So I think really at the root, we also have to think about our reaction to things when we think about chastity and lust. And chastity also gets kind of a bad rap, especially within marriage, because it's like, and most people who do AFP, like they abstain for whatever. But we even have, married saints who have had Josephied marriages. Like there's even a term for it, where, even Zelie and Louis Martin at the beginning of their marriage for the first, I don't remember how, it was several years, they lived in a Josephied marriage. They married each other and then had a chaste marriage for several years. And then there's other saints that within their marriage moved that way because they felt called to find intimacy with their spouse in other ways besides sex. And because, again, to not objectify somebody. And so I think it gets down to when there is a deep desire for something. Our last episode, we talked a little bit about generosity and greed. We have to push that aside, that greediness of wanting somebody else, and push that aside because they're not objects for us to do with as we please. They are people have their inherent dignity that God gave them. And so I think chastity has a lot to do with seeing that God-given dignity in somebody.
And to remember what the marriage act, the nature and design of it is for, what it's ordered towards, is love. The deepening of love between spouses, the deepening of our love for God, God's ability to create and make more of our love. These are all ways that we participate with God. And so it's chastity and charity are just the same coin. It's about loving others in a way that allows them to experience God fully and allows create life to come from that. If that's part of it, that's not the only reason.
And for those listeners that aren't in a married, aren't in the sacrament of marriage, one of the things I wish I had, it was given to us as a wedding gift. I kind of wish this would have been nice 5 years ago. Was Theology of the Body. It was West. What's his first
Christopher
name?
West.
So Christopher West's Theology of the Body. He explains Pope John Paul II's Theology of the Body on this. It was a audiobook. It was a CD. We just listened to it in the car. It would have been really nice to have had that before our marriage, and even probably before we were dating. So if any of you out there are single and kind of struggle with this, I really recommend that resource, because to know how beautiful the sacrament of marriage is and the marriage act is. Lauren uses a beautiful imagery with her children. The kiss that married people do, or what do you call it?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Our kids, being who our kids are, always want to know all the things. And so they early on, they were like, well, but how do you make a baby? They wanted to know, it's something mommy and daddy do. Well, what does that mean? How do you do it? Show me how you do it. And I'm like, no. That's not good, but not appropriate. So we figured out a way to say it was that we just said there's a prayer that you say that can bring children. It doesn't always bring children, but it's a prayer that you say together to unify you as a couple and draw you as close as you can possibly be. And God comes in between and prays with you and is with that prayer.
Even as an adult, I find that so beautiful.
But then we just told them, we said, and so only mommies and daddies are supposed to say this prayer, and it's a special prayer. And sometimes babies come when you say that prayer, but we say that prayer regularly because we want God to make more of the love that we have. We want to allow him to do it if he wants to. But also we say it just because we want to be close to each other and we want him to be close to us too. So we tell him that. And that's the easy way to say, it's a prayer we say with our bodies together. And then we have had to talk about how sometimes that prayer can be said outside of the protections of marriage, and people who are not married sometimes say the prayer. And sometimes babies come from that too, because God made everything that God made is good. But that's not right. So we just talk about it's not, we don't want to tell them it's not right. We just tell them it isn't the easiest way. We have to find ways to explain as these situations come up. That's not exactly the way God set it up, because it makes things harder on everybody, and harder on the mommy and harder on the daddy. And so you find ways to say it without having to be really detailed. But I also think that something that I'm having to face with this society and this culture is I have a preteen coming into, and although she's, we were really careful, and we've chosen a path that's allows us to have maximum impact, maximum influence on our kids. I think one of the things that is an iteration of chastity that has to be addressed is this temptation, like Alisha was talking about, to identify yourself according to your appetites. And we're seeing this in society right now, that our appetites or our tendencies or the things that we desire are such a big part of our identity that we define ourselves by them. This is disorder. This is unchaste. This is a self-absorbed sort of view of the self and the body and what the body is for. And so I think that one of the things that we'll have to fight against as Catholics, and we all have to work together to come up with language and search the scriptures and tradition to help us craft a narrative that we can share with each other about why defining yourself by what you desire or what kind of person or sex or you desire is so incomplete and disordered related to the human person. That isn't what a human person is. It's more than your appetites. We are not defined by our appetites. Do we have them? Yes. Do we need to order them and examine them and be aware of them? Yes. Is our identity completely wrapped up in the way we look and what or who we desire and in how we want others to talk to us or say what we want them to say about us? If you look at it this way, that seems really incomplete. And I think that that's one of the ways that chastity is perverted in our current society, that it shortchanges this incredible human person and reduces them down to the things that they think or want or crave. And I find that so disturbing.
Which goes back to humility and making ourselves less than. Like,
Right.
It's not all about me. It's not about
Right.
everything I want, and you can't keep going me.
Right, because it's an incomplete picture.
Yeah.
You know, it's opening yourself up to going, okay, God, who did you make me to be?
And who
It's
are
about
you?
you, and
Right.
I'm going to allow you to work in me to make me that person. And
There's an
and it really
entire
is a
component.
freeing thing. It's absolutely freeing. You know, like people think of, you know, like these as rules that the church lays down, but there really are ways to free us, because when you are all about yourself, you're thinking, I get to do what I want when I want. You're a slave to your appetites. You really are. You're a slave to your desires. But when you stop looking at yourself, you look to God and say, you know, God, make me who you wanted me to be, who you made me to be. Then you're opening yourself up to that which you were made for. And so you're not always saying yes to yourself about everything. You've gotten to that habit. Like, you know, we've talked about before about how, you know, like you just kind of, it becomes an addiction. You can't say no.
Without real discomfort.
Yeah, without real discomfort, you let it go and it becomes really, really, really freeing. Well, and I will say, you know, we talked a little bit in the beginning about how chastity doesn't just have to do with sex. It can also have to do with other things. And so it makes me think about, you know, lusting for the things of the world, you know, just like that desire, that appetite for, you know, like the money and the cars and the houses and the, you know, the clothes and the, you know, with the foods and the purses or whatever the case may be, and making those idols in your lives, rather than stepping back and saying no to those things and being chaste in that like it's okay to have a little, but it's not okay to just overindulge in that way. And to know that those are not my gods, you know, like we look, I think it's kind of interesting that, you know, you look back in biblical Old Testament times and you saw these people who they had Baal and they had Ra, and they had all of these gods and they had these statues, and they literally worshiped the statue itself as their god. So if somebody came and they stole that statue, they literally stole their god. So we can oftentimes think about idolatry in terms of, you know, like thinking about it in terms of God. Like, you know, what other god am I trying to worship here? But in modern times, especially in our kind of agnostic or atheistic type of culture that we live in, and really increasingly world that we live in, it's idolatry has turned to the things that we have. And I think that that's kind of something that the devil really likes, because it's hard to see that as idolatry for a lot of people, I think. At least I know that it has been for me before learning about idolatry and learning what that actually meant. Because I thought about it as, oh, well, I worship God. I don't worship these other gods, so I don't idolize anything. Oh, yeah, I did. Yeah, I do. Still sometimes.
Yeah, we're going to do a whole series on idols in our lives.
Yeah.
Pretty soon, I think.
Yeah, so it's, you know, it can definitely have to do, there's a need to be chaste in more than just the marriage bed. There's a need to be chaste in pretty much every area of your life in order to experience that freedom that God really calls us to.
And you're talking about, I'm trying to find it, Fulton Sheen has a quote about, we can tell what we worship by where we put our time. And it's not an exact quote because I can't find it right this second, but it's one that I think of often, like, where am I spending most of my time? And that's where our, you make time for the things that are important to you. I think that was part of the quote too. And so, what is more important, our relationship with God and those that he's put in our lives, or what we want? And that's what it kind of comes down to.
It's the ordering of the appetites, especially the lusts of the flesh. I don't remember who says it, but someone said that it was one of the saints that Mary came to them and told them that more people are in hell because of the sins of the flesh than any other sins. And I think she's referring specifically to the sins of lust in all its iterations and, impurity in all its iterations as it's developed throughout human history. And that really struck me because when I think of really grave sins, really heinous sins, terrible crimes that have been committed in the history, all the serial killers, things like that, it always comes back to someone warring over something in the flesh, whether it's whether it's a sexual thing, or even whether it's just like a possession thing, like it's mine, and I'm going to do violence to you to preserve what is mine, or to someone else. It always has to do with a war inside of the flesh, and I think that chastity allows us to order that interior, that innate need to enthrone the appetites in the right direction. Because it's there. Obviously, it's part of being human.
Well, and I would say I don't, maybe some of our listeners, I guess I could just think of the rebuttal that I had that just popped into my head when you were talking about that, just that would come back from my agnostic days. You said that it's always about a war of the flesh, a war over something of the world, but there have been so many wars that have happened over religion. And that's a huge rebuttal. That's a huge obstacle for a lot of people coming into faith, is because they're like, well, there's so many wars fought over religion, why would I want to be a part of that? But I think that, and there's this kind of a nuanced thing, because there have been just wars that have been fought over religion, but there have also been unjust ones. And I think when you talk looking at unjust wars or conflicts or violence on a smaller scale being committed over religion or over faith, I think that does come down to oftentimes that pride. And that, like this is about me. This is, it might not be, I'm looking at something, maybe money's behind it, maybe it's not, but ultimately it's about me and how do I interpret things and how I want to lay it down and make other people obedient. So looking at people who would say that it's not all done just for worldly things, but it's done for religious things. And you have wars that were just and wars that weren't, and it was all about internalizing, and this is all about me and what I want, and I want to stamp this into you. So I think that what that comes from is you have this church that Jesus founded, and he said, these are my teachings. The church hands them down to you. But then people decide, well, I don't want to listen to the church, or I have questions about the church, but I'm not going to dig into this, and I'm going to put my own interpretation and my own biases and my own intentions into this. And I think that can, and that includes people within the Catholic Church and people who separate themselves from the Catholic Church. But I think that there is a needed level of humility to go, okay, well, I might not understand this teaching of the church, or I might not understand, what's going on here, and I might be angry about these other things, and, these people who are wanting to commit violence on this for the sake of religion or for the sake of their faith, or, in the name of God. And I think it does take a level of humility there and obedience to the church, just to say, okay, this is Jesus's church. This is not
the Church of Alisha.
This is not the Church of Alisha. Yeah.
Well, and the church is ran by men, like man, not like necessarily men, but like it's by man, humans, and so and we're not, and we're fallen, and so things aren't going to be perfect, even in the church.
And
things are
there
not
have been
going to be
horrific
perfect.
grievances committed in the name of religion that God had no part
But
in whatsoever. And we have to be open and honest about that. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that, if you dig into it, when you come down to it, it has to do with what you said, pride and power. Mm-hmm. Men who got it twisted. Yeah. Men and women who got it twisted. And it became about pride and power. And you can see that every single time when like one of these unjust wars of religion has taken place, mm-hmm. where man mucked it up, mm-hmm. And created a terrible situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's why God has laid it kind of on our shoulders. He says that we're supposed to proclaim the good news. We're supposed to act in virtue and act in charity and, be examples for the people around us. And we need to be diligent in that. Yes. We need to, that brings up our second virtue, diligence, that defeats slothfulness. Because if we are lazy in our faith, if we decide, well, I'm just going to settle for, this line, this area that I'm at in my faith, and I'm not going to persevere and I'm not going to progress any further in my relationship with God, then that pride, is absolutely there. That's the foundation of that slothfulness. But when we decide, whatever happens, that conversion moment happens for us where we decide, okay, actually, we're going to work for the furthering of the message of God in the world and the furthering of the church, in our own homes and in the world around us and the people in our lives. That's when I think that we can try to make a difference and a positive difference in terms of the name of Christianity. And Annie had quoted somebody recently that she had listened to who said something along the lines of she thought that Christians had done more damage to the name of Christianity than atheists ever have.
Definitely, Christians definitely true. Lacking in joy. And that was from Mark Hart he was a guest on another podcast. But the Bible Geek,
100% true.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think it's really telling that we're ending this little series with diligence, because it's like humility. It's so interwoven with all of them. They're all very intertwined, but we require diligence for all of these things. And I know something that we've talked about a little bit about our root sins on different episodes and stuff, and something I kind of have. I've been feeling like that in learning more about it is that my root sin is probably the sin of sensuality, not meaning that I'm an overly that chastity is an issue
right,
with me.
That actually,
but it's more that I really struggle with the feelings and needing to have those sensory inputs of things. And so diligence is very difficult for me to put aside what I feel and keep going, even when I'm not feeling getting up in the morning and pray, spending that time in prayer.
Especially when you feel desolation. Mm-hmm. When you feel that desolation, you're not getting any of those consolations from God, and He feels far away. Yep. Being able to go, okay, I feel this way, but God has taught me this.
Right.
And so putting that, throwing away those, that looking at those feelings and clinging to what it is that God has told you.
Right, exactly.
Oh, yeah.
And all I could think of through all of this episode so far has been, this is hard. And it is. And I think that's why diligence is so important, because when we don't fight for what is right, what God's will is, then it's really easy to turn off. Sloth is the sin that diligence defeats. And it's really easy to get lost in the chaos. It's, we've been talking about busy schedules and overeating and children biting for attention. And, we've talked about these different ways to kind of combat those things. But when they're all happening at the same time, it's really easy to drown in them. But that's the whole point of diligence, is that we have to keep facing towards God And it's not to say that just looking at God and praying is going to fix everything, because I think it's important to say too that you can keep fighting and things can still feel overwhelming. And but it's important to be diligent and not, because really when I think of diligence versus sloth, the word that comes to mind too is hope. Like you can't lose hope. And like Alisha said, and maybe it was the last episode, about humility isn't about not being who you are, but
it's humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's about thinking of yourself less.
But it's also making yourself more, like the freedom that you've been talking about, because you're free to be who God made you to be.
Well, see, God likes to work in paradoxes, I think. Like, you die in order so that you can live.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, like, I mean, he likes to work in those paradoxes, so it doesn't really make any sense in terms of, like, humanly terms, but when you're looking at the supernatural, God can make beautiful things come out of these very difficult situations. And I think that what you're talking about, Stacy, brings to mind for me, like, perseverance and reaching for that relationship with God. Because, you know, I've talked about before, I've had those times where I am just angry and I'm upset and I am in my emotions and I'm thinking about myself and I say, God, I'm struggling with this. I want you to come in here and, you know, give me peace. And I start to feel that peace and I'm like, actually, you know what? I want to be angry. And it's like, and it begs the question, okay, so I'm working for this. Do I really want to work for this? Do I actually, like I've said before, I want God to be my means and my end. Do I actually? You know? And I would say, yes, I do. But am I living that out fully? Absolutely not. And so, and I think that's probably the case for absolutely everybody, unless you are a walking saint, you know, and that comes to you more easily because you persevered and you've gotten to a point where you've allowed God to take over the majority or all of your heart. But for me, where I'm at right now, I struggle with that. That, like, do I really want God to be a part of this? Sometimes I really don't, even though, like, I know that outside of these feelings, I do. When I'm in those feelings, sometimes I just want to be selfish and I want to be greedy and I want to be slothful in my perseverance and my relationship with God, because I want to think about myself. There's the pride. You got to come out of yourself. You got to try to allow God to humble you in those moments, so that you can be free from me, and be free from wanting yourself to suffer. I think it's so interesting that so often we want to suffer, not necessarily even because we feel guilty about something. That can definitely be a motivating factor. But when I am angry about something, or I'm angry at somebody or something or whatever's going on, and I just want to sit in my anger and I want to be mad and I want to replay this thing over and over and in my head, you know, like I do with my kids sometimes. I want to replay that thing and, you know, I just want to yell at them and all that stuff. Is it really worth it? You know, like I've talked about before, like, is the way that I want to respond right now worth my relationship being damaged with my children, and then also not furthering my relationship with God?
I think there's another aspect of diligence that we haven't discussed yet, but it's kind of important. I think that diligence is an active virtue. It's sort of like piety in action. It's making straight paths for your feet. And that means it takes planning. If you are trying to work on the virtue of being more chaste in your marriage, then you're going to look pretty closely at your fertility calendar. You're going to learn to try and find times where you can freely love your husband, or whatever it is that you have planned between the two of you for your married life. If you are trying, like you were talking about, wanting to acquire more humility, you will make straight paths for your feet by avoiding things or thoughts that cause you to have an inflated sense of yourself, or a bigger sense of yourself than you should relative to the situation. I think diligence is constantly going back to making those straight paths ahead of time, being faithful and persistent to do that in order so that virtue can flow in. So I think, like you said, diligence runs through all of this in the acquisition of virtues, but it actually does tend toward a more active connotation of like a farmer has to get up and milk the cows. He's diligent to do that. If he doesn't, what will happen? Chaos will ensue.
You have an unhappy cow.
You guys are farmers. You understand diligence. Farming is literally, that's what it's, that you get up, you keep doing it. You plant when you plant. You harvest when you harvest. And it doesn't matter how you feel. You're going to do it. Yeah. It doesn't matter if you have COVID-19, you're going to get out there and do it. Because that's what diligence is. It's understanding that it depends on this.
And there's a time and season for things.
Right. And so I think that's when we're talking even specifically about chastity, like we are today, being diligent to guard your eyes from the things like Annie was talking about that cause you to compare your marriage to someone else's. Or that's a huge part of chastity, I think, is guarding your thoughts, comparing your marriage to other people's marriage, or your sex life to someone else's sex life, or your sex life to some imaginary sex life that you have in your head, or you know,
or
what,
even your past,
right? Or past,
newlywed sex life to
right
to 30 years, or maybe. And while you have children and postpartum, and because there's a time for things, there's an order to things, and I think that we have to keep that in mind.
We have to keep plugging along and persevering and keep on trying and keep getting up, being diligent to make those straight paths so that we don't fall because we just didn't get out there and scoop where we should have scooped
and when we do fall, because we will, be diligent about getting back up.
Yes, Annie. Oh my gosh, that's so beautiful.
Well, and I think too, with all of these virtues, recognizing that God is there with us, that even when he doesn't feel close, that he is there, that he's made that promise to us, that he's not going to leave us, that he's going to be with us, that he's going to be there when we call for him. And so just really learning and conditioning ourselves to call on him when we're learning these virtues. And I think it's important too that, like, to know that, you know, this is a lot. We've talked about a lot in these last 3 episodes, and these are things that you learn lifelong. And one of the things that I think are probably helpful for a lot of people that I've learned is that, you know, when you're trying to grow in virtue, you can focus on one thing at a time. You know, like you're inevitably going to encounter difficulties in all of them throughout your life, even if you're just focusing on one. But let's say, like, you really have a hard time with chastity, you know, really focusing in on that and allowing God to enter into that part of your life and really focus on that. And when you start gaining some ground in that and you start, you know, feeling more confident in that and going like, okay, like God has shown me here that he is here with me with this. You know, maybe something else is creeping up in your life, or you notice that, you know, maybe you've been envious of people, you haven't been kind. So you need to work on that. But it doesn't have to be, I think, an overwhelming, like, oh my gosh, there's these virtues that I have to do because I have to become perfect and all of this. Right. Like, God is merciful.
There's also a sense that we should join the Lord where he's already working here and allow him to tell us what needs to be worked on. Yeah. Because, you know, if we look at our lives, we'll start cataloging, being like, look at all of this stuff. Oh my gosh, look at all of this.
That's a good point.
When God is saying, no, we're not doing that right now. Remember, I've been bringing this up in your heart. We're going to work on this right now because this is the season for this. And I know you see all that other stuff. We'll get to that. Will you let me in here and move around? I think we have to be careful to let God lead this journey. What virtues do you want to work on today, Lord? You are the one who's the gardener in my heart. I will follow behind you and see where you stop and sit and dig. And that's where I'll work too.
And recognizing, I think too, that like God is not asking of us to grow in these virtues and to defeat these sins because he sees how ugly and awful we are. You know, yeah, he sees the sin. He knows it's not good. He knows that it comes between us and him. And the reason why he wants to defeat those sins in our hearts is because he wants to be close to us. Yeah. Because he loves us. And every single thing that God does is out of love. Everything,
and a desire to be close to us.
Exactly. Out of love for us. Absolutely.
And these virtues are gifts. And he wants to give them to us in abundance. And everything that God gives brings joy.
one of the things that you said earlier, and I just hadn't had a chance to jump in because you guys have had such beautiful things that kept going. You talked about asking, you even it's all been good stuff. But you're talking about how you ask God to help you with these things. And I think sometimes because we hear these beautiful stories of the saints and how these mystical things happen with the saints, sometimes we think that that's the way God talks to everybody. And we have to remember that sometimes God is talking to us through a friend who mentioned something, and then that same thing shows up at Mass in the scripture reading, and then it comes up again in this opportunity to practice that virtue with a friend or a coworker or a child who has gotten on your last nerve, or whatever. It's just God speaking to us is not always going to be some sort of clouds coming down and beautiful, wonderful dreams. Sometimes it's just the everyday. He brings people into our lives. And we have to remember that we aren't meant to be these little islands. God created us in community to help each other journey to heaven. And he speaks to us through these people he puts in our lives and these situations he puts in our lives and their opportunities to live out these virtues. And as always, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Join us again next week.
Until then, may God bless you and may Mary accompany you.
Coffee and Catholics is a proud partner of the Smart Catholics Podcast Network. Find new shows to love, meet like-minded Catholics, and join the community at smartcatholics.com.